So first of all, just to say, sharing all of the excitement once again at this wonderful toolkit launch. I think those of you who have been, many of you have been sharing online in our joy and excitement at this. So I think the first thing that we wanted to do was just have an initial sort of collection of responses from all of you. I hope you've already had a look at the at least at the visuals of the toolkit. If not, having read some of it, I know that some of you have been reading it already as we were developing it these last few months. So one of the first things that we wanted to do was to share this Menti word cloud survey and ask you to share your initial responses of what you think of the toolkit. So if we could just take a minute to get a sense from everybody of what you think so far, and I'm going to share the results as we go in a second on the screen. And yeah, I hope the link works for you. Please let us know if it does not. And I'm just going to share the screen right now. Oh, I love it. I see that the word timely is coming up a lot. Exciting, thoughtful, engaging, fierce. Yes. Oh, I can't tell you how much joy I'm feeling right now. Like, this is the best present. I have a birthday coming up in a couple of weeks, so forget if any. I really don't need anything except this, because I'm just so happy seeing this come together, both in the visuals of it and the responses that y'all are sharing right now, as well as just how insightful and amazing and deep this thing is. All right. We will keep accepting your feedback because I'm just loving it so much. But with that initial collection of responses to this wonderful, wonderful toolkit, I really want to go back a bit and hear a little bit about how this all came together, her story of this wonderful collective piece of work. And for that, I pass to Bridget.
Thanks so much, Sanam. I share your joy and excitement over hearing and seeing those responses and seeing this toolkit out there. My name, for any of you who I'm not familiar with, is Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm speaking with you today from unceded Lenape land, or so-called Brooklyn. And I'm really, really grateful to have this space in this moment, which is really reflective. Especially, we didn't necessarily time it so that we would be doing this at the end of 2020. We didn't time any of this, as none of us did, and that's partly why I think this response is special to so many of us, because you know, a lot of our organizations who are involved in this collective effort, this feminist collective response, are longtime allies, partners, friends who work in global policy spaces around women's rights, gender equality, climate change, sustainable development, taxation, economic justice, and, you know, had been really preparing and gearing up for a very important year from a gender equality perspective, the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. We're gearing up for the Commission on the Status of Women in March. And I think probably the first real understanding of the impact of this pandemic and how far-reaching it was going to be was when the CSW, the first major UN meeting, was canceled right at the end of February. And so kind of just in the mix of trying to figure out how to move forward from that space, we started seeing both analysis on, okay, what are the potential gendered impacts of this pandemic? What does this mean for multilateralism? But also just starting to really understand that this was going to be a deeply embodied crisis that we would each face in our own communities and countries in different ways, personally and politically. And so in the midst of trying to do the things that we normally do, which is set agendas and create action plans, we put out a call to just have a call. And I remember that first call that we had. It was a Monday morning, and it was very, there was a lot of emotion, and it was very much about sharing what we were feeling and where we are in this pandemic. And there was no set agenda to kind of take things forward from there. But as I've said in different spaces, as feminists, we didn't leave there without next steps or should we meet again, or what's the agenda? And we kept meeting, and we were very careful in our meeting together as it started to become clear that we really needed a way to track what was happening in what we were seeing in our communities and in our countries and in the multilateral spaces we were working together in. And so we launched a really large-scale voluntary collective mutual aid effort where we had tons of volunteers, and each individual member of this collective was really volunteering their time to create an online repository, which is the Feminist COVID Response website that we'll put in the chat as well. And the website itself was developed by volunteers in the beginning. So it was this really kind of incredible care response that was both deep in the understanding of the potential of the crises that we were facing, of the impacts that it would have, as well as the need to have a feminist response. And we gathered together what we considered key principles for a feminist response that would center care, that would center those who are most impacted. And how could we really understand the feminist analysis and bring together the feminist analysis that was happening across from different partners. And from that first meeting, we've continued to meet together to grow out opportunities for conversation, for joy. We're really equally as proud of not only these products and resources that have come out, like the toolkit, but also things like the online playlist and the sci-fi book club, which was what are the ways that we can kind of grow our feminist imaginations in this time to make sure we don't quote unquote even build back better, that we build forward in a way that we haven't ever done before, really. And so a couple of months ago, we, having worked on the repository and having seen that we have a lot of different pieces out there, we really wanted to work on something that would put the principles into action, that would collect together the best practice examples that we were seeing, and that would provide some tools for both assessing and monitoring what are the impacts in our own communities, countries, et cetera, from a feminist perspective, and then really coming up with tools that can hold governments and decision makers account. So that's the basis, I think, that's the history of where we are today. And then we had some incredible, I just want to take a moment, because I don't know if they'll shout themselves out, but Diana, who you're going to hear from, who worked tirelessly to create this toolkit with conversation and reflection from what had already, what our colleagues had already been putting together. And then our beautiful artist, Jessica, that we worked with, created this toolkit. So just a big shout out to them and their love and leadership in this work. I'll pass back to you, Sunam.
Thanks so much, Bridget. And I'm so glad that we started with with that little look back, because I really think that we started from a place where it was really bewildering, and uh, we really wanted to build support for each other and ourselves. And I think we've done it in such a beautiful and creative way, as you've said, not just through this piece, but with the playlist, with the book club, and continually holding those spaces for our collective. But I know that there are some deep level sort of pieces that that we would love to share the details of first in this toolkit. So without further ado, the author, who I have been so happy to push into this project and work with the last few months, Diana, please go ahead and tell us all about what to find in the toolkit and how to use it.
Thank you so much, Sanam, and Bridget as well, and to all the other sisters and colleagues in this movement. I think if I recall back when I was first asked if I wanted to take this up, I was half excited and I was also half like really, really scared, because it just felt like such a tremendous undertaking to try and work collectively in bringing together what our visions are for the kind of feminist future that we want to see post this pandemic and this crisis that we are all basically currently faced with. And I'm so thrilled that we've come to this point where we're able to share the outcome of this month of labor of love amongst all of us, with everyone, and with some really amazing visuals to accompany it as well. And I really think, and I really do believe that this has been a tremendous team effort, a collective effort, not just of myself and the core groups, but also of many, many other members in the collectives who actually contributed to many different aspects of the toolkit and brought the toolkit to what we have with us today on the website. So I'm gonna just basically walk folks through what some of the key aspects of the toolkits that we have now. And then hopefully once I've finished doing that, we'll get another chance to have another conversation. I know Sanam has another Mentimeter planned out to hear back from all of you as well about what you thought about the toolkit and what are some of the ways that we can continue to use this in different spaces and in different advocacy to really try and realize the kind of feminist future that we're all talking about and have been working for in our activism and in our communities. So I'm gonna just quickly be sharing my screen so folks can actually see the page on our website where we have the toolkit currently hosted on. So I know folks are probably by now really super familiar with our Feminist Response to COVID-19 website. And you can see here where we have basically put the toolkit, and that this toolkit comprises of basically, you could say, three large parts. There is the monitoring and advocacy toolkit, which you can see here with this beautiful PDF. And then it's also being complemented as well as accompanied by two other online tools, which are the Advocacy Timeline, as well as the Power Mapping, which I'm gonna come back to a little bit later. And we're also, of course, really, really thrilled to be able to share this toolkit with all of you in multiple languages. So we have them in French, as you can see here as well, including the PDF version of the toolkit also in French. And then we also have the same toolkit also translated into Spanish. And so folks are most welcome to access these toolkit in the various languages that we have on the website. We don't currently have, and we could perhaps have this conversation as well later, the more online dynamic parts of the toolkit in any other languages, but as we'll see a little bit later on, these are fairly online, flexible tools, and there are so many ways that folks can continue to contribute to it on different aspects, on different things, as well as in different languages, if that is something that the collective feels very strongly about. And so going back to the monitoring and advocacy toolkit, as I mentioned, all of these has been really the efforts of the collective. And it's really a toolkit that, and I'm just gonna put a different screen now. Let's see. Where we're going to get to see the beautiful toolkit with the amazing visualizations that we have with it. And so basically this monitoring and advocacy toolkit is really inspired and just really taking forward a lot of the work, the activism, the monitoring, the advocacies, the demands that we as feminists and many other allies as well as social movements has been putting forth even prior to the pandemic, but then also throughout this entire pandemic, as well as in terms of like, you know, discussing or bringing about, as Bridget mentioned, like a much more different and better world than what we currently have right now. And so as feminists, we do know and we recognize how all of our work, our advocacies, our demands, and our policies are very much grounded in the realities of ourselves as well as our communities on the ground, of women, of gender non-conforming persons, of the marginalized, of the poor, of indigenous folks. And so therefore that's why this particular toolkit comprises of both a monitoring component of it as well as an advocacy component of it. And so if you see here, where we have the table of content, and we are very lucky because we have a fairly interactive sort of like table of content going on here. So if you just click on any of these, it will basically take you to the actual page of that particular parts. And so therefore, if you are interested to use some parts of the toolkit, but not others, or some parts of it speaks much more strongly to you than others, then you are most welcome to use it, because this toolkit is ours to use in any way we want, in any way we see fit and best, in order to advance the sort of feminist future that we want to see. And so we have this basically broken into two parts: the monitoring, which is the observing as well as reflecting, and then the advocacy, which is the plan as well as the action. And so under the monitoring, which I'm just going to click here, where we go to observe as well as reflect, what we have put here is basically a set of questions that are organized around our feminist principles, the 6 principles of the feminist response to COVID-19, which was developed by the collective when the collective first emerged. And under each, and you will see as you probably scroll through some of these questions, the questions are really centered around how the pandemic has impacted on women, on community, on LGBTIQ folks, on poor, on marginalized, on indigenous peoples, on persons with disability. And it's also really centered on how has some of the policies or steps or responses that we see governments or different sort of like multilateral agencies or bodies have undertaken since the pandemic started, and how have those policies, responses actually impacted on women, or perhaps not impacted at all, or how have they benefited women, or perhaps not benefited women in any way at all, and have they really reached the most poorest and marginalized within our society, or has it perhaps just benefited the same elite few that has been accumulating wealth prior to the pandemic, and even more so throughout this pandemic. And so the questions are really sort of like, as you can see, some of them overlap and some of them fits under one or more of the principles, which is of course inevitable, because as we all know, all of our responses have always been systemic and structural, and all of the issues and all of the principles are often very much interlinked with one another. And so you will find some of these questions in perhaps not where you expect them to be. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, some of these questions, perhaps some of them speaks more closer to the work and the advocacy that you are doing, or that the issues that the communities are facing, and then some perhaps less so. Some of the questions are much more reflective of what's happening at local or national level, where perhaps some of the questions is perhaps looking or reflecting and observing more at what's happening at regional, multilateral, or global levels. And this part of the monitoring also has a bit of a monitoring that we are building from a lot of the submissions that many of the members of the collective has actually put forth. What we would say examples of some feminist responses in practice that we have seen from leaders at different levels in different parts of the world. And in many ways we recognize that perhaps not all of these examples are completely perfect or encompasses every aspect that we want. But I think what we really wanted to try and sort of illustrate here is that, you know, some of the policy responses, which we'll come into a little bit later at the advocacy part, were things that are not entirely impossible, because we have seen some leaders and some governments actually introducing that sort of policies in different ways. And so I think the idea is to really take on some of those and to see how much more further we could push for the kind of policies that we want to see for our feminist future. And so that's the first part, which is the monitoring, which we also call observe and reflect. And then the second part of this PDF toolkit basically consists of the advocacy component. And this particular advocacy component, which we also call plan and action, is also complemented by the two other online tools, which I'll come back to later. And this particular part, the advocacy part, is also similarly as the monitoring part organized around the 6 principles of the feminist response to COVID-19. And many of them, as many of you will see, are the calls and demands and the policy recommendations that many members of the collectives ourselves, as well as some of our allies, and as well as some of the other social movements that we've worked with or been part of, has been calling for even prior to this pandemic. And of course, because we recognize the limitation in terms of length and so forth, we do recognize that many of these recommendations and policies that we've tried to put together in this advocacy guide is also not exhaustive. It's not possible to cover everything, but we did try as much as possible, especially on issues and points that many members of the collectives have been working on and want to see more sort of like collective advocacy and work around that. And a lot or some of this advocacy calls as well as demand are also being accompanied as much as possible with data, as well as other resources and tools, which we hope will be helpful when you, for example, go at whatever level you work on to advocate for some of these policies with governments, officials, with decision makers, or with multilateral institutions and UN agencies and so forth. And so there are, of course, some data and information. Some of it also include examples where some of these policies have already been put in practice. And similarly, as well, as I mentioned, it's once again not exhaustive. And I know that there are perhaps many more policy recommendations and responses that are being called and continue to be called out by our movement itself as this pandemic continued to sort of emerge and evolve. And similarly as well to the monitoring part, some of these points do overlap. And some of them are clearly, of course, interlinked because we all know as feminists who have been long demanding for systemic and structural changes that a lot of our demands and our policy recommendations are interlinked and are connected with one another in the same way that many of these policies are interconnected, in the same way that many of our issues are also interconnected, and in the same way that many of our human rights are all interlinked, indivisible, as well as inalienable. And many of these policies, some of them could be used or could perhaps be more suitable for local or national level advocacies. Some are perhaps more regional and global. But I think another thing that we do also recognize is that many of the policies that are being made, whether at local, national, regional, as well as global level, are also very much interlinked, since the connection between macro as well as micro policies are there as well. And we have seen that in many cases as well. And so these are basically the two key parts that you will find in this PDF toolkit, which, as I mentioned, I'm very happy to mention once again, we also have this being translated in both Spanish as well as French, and you can find that on the Feminist COVID Response website. So now I am gonna take us to the two earlier mentioned complementary tool that we have, which is also hosted on the website. And the two online tools, and it's live and it's complementary, and I'll be kind of like elaborating a little bit more on that, is firstly an advocacy timeline, and secondly is a power mapping. So the advocacy timeline and both these tools are basically live because they are being hosted by a tool called Airtable, which you could easily edit, or anyone who has an access to it could easily edit, and then it gets automatically generated with those additions on the website as you see them right now. And they are also live because I think we recognize that a lot of these aspects that we have put into these two tools are ongoing, are still evolving, and are potentially subject to further changes or further addition as the time progresses. So the first tool, which is the advocacy timeline, is basically just a timeline of some of the key sort of advocacy spaces as well as opportunities, whether at regional as well as international level, where a lot of the COVID responses as well as policy making, whether you talk about trade or debt or sustainable development, such as, and some of the meetings that we are very much familiar with, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, or even the review of the Beijing Plus 25 through the Generation Equality Forum. And so these are meetings that are coming up. And they are currently being organized according to the ones that are supposed to be happening or has already happened, and extend currently for now until meetings that are supposed to take place by July of next year. And I think we could all agree, due to the pandemic still being very much in all of our lives, that many of the dates of these meetings remain uncertain, and it's one of those areas where, you know, a lot of the informations and dates and entry points will continually evolve as and when, and depending on how the responses or how the current pandemic sort of like evolved from here on. So if you clicked on one of these entries, for example, so I'm just going to click on the 65th session on the Commission on the Status of Women, which is supposed to happen next year, at least for now, it's supposed to happen next year. You will see here, firstly, the dates that we know of for now, which could, as I mentioned earlier, with many of these meetings could still be subjected to further changes. There is a brief explanation for folks who perhaps are not so familiar with this meeting. And then it is also, I think, as importantly, accompanied by an access point for engagement. So if you are an organization who are perhaps not that familiar with the Commission on the Status of Women, and it is one of the areas that you would like to get involved, then what we've tried to put in all of these meetings is an access point for engagement. So a point where groups who have not yet been engaged could potentially engage in that particular space. And the same goes for some of the other meetings as well, whether they are regional level. So for example, here we have the annual regional forum on sustainable development, which is the regional forum for the monitoring and review of the sustainable development goals. This one is specifically for the European region. And you can also see here, apart from the dates, which is now still up to be confirmed, a brief explanation, also an access point for engagement for folks who perhaps have not yet been engaged in this particular process, but would like to be. But of course, not all these meetings necessarily have an access to an engagement point, particularly if it's a new meeting or a space that doesn't have any access to civil society in general. Like one past example is the Finance in Common Summit, which I do know that some of our sisters in the collective were able to sort of engage in, but it was a fairly new space. And so there is a bit of a brief explanation, but there wasn't any access point for engagement because that was not necessarily clear for the space itself, and it didn't necessarily have a dedicated civil society space. So that's one example where perhaps that information is not available. But as I mentioned, this timeline as well as the next power mapping is being hosted by an online tool. And so depending on who has access to it, folks who do have the information could potentially add that information in there or share it with someone who could add it. And so that can, help other folks who want to be engaging in this process know that, okay, this is how I could potentially engage in it. And so the second and the third piece basically of the toolkit is what we call the power mapping. And basically it's a collection of quotes detailing who said who on what or where and when at which event, organized under these various thematic areas. And the idea of trying to put this together is that if you were trying to perhaps advocate for, let's say, for example, debt restructuring, which is one of the advocacy points that we have inside the PDF toolkit that I earlier shared, then if you were to go under the debt section, and if you were to click on, for example, this one, you have someone who is speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, basically calling for debt restructuring and write-off, and that's why it's being organized under debt. And then you can see when the actual speech was being made, and then there is also a link where you could click open and see what exactly was the statement that had been made. And so that could potentially be useful in some of the advocacies that folks are doing. Another example is, let's say, if we wanted to talk about under the thematic area of gender equality, and then if you click this opened, you have, for example, the president of ECOSOC saying that our crisis response must be gender responsive and address gender inequalities. And similarly, you'll have another quote here, for example, from the Secretary General of the UN, saying similarly about how stimulus funds should put money directly into women's hands. And so if you were engaging, whether at local, national, or global level, and one of your key calls is basically, reiterating that stimulus funds that is being put forth in response to the pandemic should be put directly into women's hand, then hopefully this quote can be sort of like an additional support in articulating that advocacy point that you might have. So these are the basically kind of like three pieces of the toolkit that we have, the PDF, the power mapping, as well as the advocacy timeline. And with these two last pieces, as I mentioned, it's being hosted on this page here that folks can see, called an Airtable. And it's basically, edit by whoever who has access to it. And then you get to see any of those additions here on the advocacy timeline or the power mapping here. And so, and so we're really, really excited to be sharing this with folks, not just within the collective, but perhaps outside the collective as well, as part of our efforts and, as part of our contribution to the movements, both feminist or allied and otherwise, to really, really try and bring in us a different kind of future, and particularly a feminist future, because what other kind of future should there be other than a feminist future post this pandemic? And so I'm gonna hand this back to Sanam now.
Thanks, Deanna, for this wonderful overview. Yeah, absolutely.